What's up, everybody? Well, I guess this is just the week of me finding scholars that back up everything I've been telling you guys for the last few years. And they'll explain how they have used the exact same method as me and taken little fragments of knowledge where we do have them, applying a little logic to it and coming to a conclusion. Only their version doesn't factor in the Earth change cycle. Oh yeah. Hey, algorithm, what's going on, man? I thought we were friends. You unshadow banned me for about a month and it was great seeing all kinds of growth, and then you made me invisible again. So can we stop with the shadow banning and show this to new people, please? Thank you. Okay, when I first started this channel, I did an insane amount of research trying to figure out where a break in the paper trail was going back in history. And we've got all kinds of stuff going back to around 1400s. And as I show you how academia came up with its version of ancient history, I'll try to show you guys the who, what, when, where, why, and how of that. Let's start out with good old Josephus, who is the sole primary source of everything we think we know about the ancient Holy Land after Jesus. And he's the only source that we have for the Romans involved in all of that too, Vespasian and Titus. So there is so much history that rests on the shoulders of Josephus.
I could sleep better. Like, is there such a document? But first, just talk about the sources. Like,
Okay.
what do you rely on most to tell this story?
So it's clear that I rely on Josephus more than anyone else. Josephus dies around the year 100, and he tells the story down to the year 74. But he starts the story with the creation in his works and goes all the way up to 74. He's a very problematic source, but a very, very rich source as well. My story goes to the year 136, and then with an epilogue going to like the year 638. So Josephus doesn't help me after that. I've got to use other sources, and we don't have any Josephus afterwards. You have to piece the story together from different sources.
So he says that Josephus is a very problematic source, as in there are incongruencies and stories that stretch the imagination, which we'll get into a little bit, and that aside from the Bible, Josephus is the sole primary source of everything from creation up to 70 whatever AD. Then we don't have another Josephus after that. We have Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and that's about it. Tacitus just happens to write of the exact same time frame as Josephus. Exact same thing with Pliny the Younger. And then we've got nothing until the First Crusade in 1095 AD, 1,000 years later. So this is equivalent to us having one account of the First Crusade and then jumping straight to the current conflict that is going on right now there. That's quite a gap.
No, which is a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the thing we learn in, being Ancient History Professional Academy 101 is everything's about the sources. And how do you read the sources critically? But it's also about how do you fill in the blanks. And one of the things about being a good ancient historian is you have to learn how these societies worked, what it meant to think like a Roman, what it meant to think like a Jew or a Greek in ancient times. You also have to spend a lot of time in the Mediterranean. I know it's a hard life, but you got to tromp around beautiful Mediterranean places and get a sense of the landscape, the seasons, traditional agriculture, how people did things. Because once you know all that, you can fill in the blanks. You have to be honest and say, this is speculation. This is informed speculation. And then in the footnotes, you can tell us how. But when you know, for example, how people navigated in ancient times, then you can get some sense about how they would get from A to B. Or, for instance, when you know, because you've read lots of examples of this, that a classic way to take a city when you're laying siege to it in ancient times is to attack in the pre-dawn hours, because the other guy's going to be sleepy and not going to be ready for it. So if you read in a source, they attacked this city in the pre-dawn hours and it was a big shock and nobody expected it, that's not true. Everybody knows that's when you're going to attack in ancient times. So that kind of thing allows you to be a better historian, tell the story better. And so it's not merely making it up, but it's informed speculation based on the depth of your knowledge.
So yeah, it's also about how you fill in the blanks. And the examples he gives are just the most basic of logic. It doesn't take a West Point valedictorian to know that, yeah, they're gonna attack before the sun comes up when that day finally comes. So if a historian tells you they were surprised by this, then he just doesn't know basic logic. That still doesn't change the fact that we're using the word of one person who by his own volition is a traitor for the entire history of this region. So we're going to do a little more about Josephus because he's the cornerstone that everything else rests on here. And then we're going to go into some other sources that are just as shady.
A text that does not survive. And as scholars have looked at the Greek version that we have of that, the Greek version of the Jewish War, this does not look like, or doesn't have any of the hallmarks of a translation from Aramaic into Greek. In other words, if you translate a book, it'll often have some of...
Okay, he says it doesn't have any of the hallmarks of a translation from Aramaic into Greek. If you guys have been paying attention to my videos lately, everything has been translated from Greek into Latin in the Middle Ages via Arabic texts. But different languages have different syntax, a different way of arranging the words. So in English, we say, how old is that horse? In Spanish, they say, horse, how old? So scholars usually see little telltale signs when something's been translated from one language into another. And he's saying that the Greek version of Josephus has no hallmarks of this. And as you see right here, Aramaic or Hebrew original does not survive.
In rabbinic sources, in the Talmud and so forth, there are stories that parallel stories Josephus tells. And since Josephus is the main source for these, they probably are tacitly or silently using him as their source. In other words, there's some things that he tells, stories about like the siege at Masada and so forth, that are just too good to skip, even though he's a traitor and you don't want to use him. And so they rewrite it as if they had a different source.
Okay, so he says in rabbinic literature, they liked some of the stories, especially like the siege of Jerusalem and their valiant efforts against the Romans, but that they too are just copying Josephus and changing up the wording some to make it sound like they didn't copy Josephus. So let me just give you his story in a nutshell. He is a self-proclaimed great general of the Greys, but when he first met Vespasian, he just knew that he was destined to become emperor, so he wanted to be on the winning team, right? So he is the sole source for the legendary standoff at Masada. You can't make it 2 minutes into a Grey lecture without hearing about Josephus. But here, according to him, they're surrounded by the Romans. There's no chance of success, so they make a self-deletion pact. And I think there's about 100 of them. Well, they decide to draw lots, and then basically every person would off the person to their right or something so that it wasn't self-deletion. Well, Josephus somehow positioned himself just right so that he'd get down to the final two, and then he convinces the other person, well, we don't have to do this. We can just give up now. So by his own account here, he defies all of the odds, 100 to 1 against him, and just happens to be one of the only two survivors of this. And then with the siege of Jerusalem, it's another tall tale of the cunning and wily Greys. The Romans had had the city surrounded for a while, and they finally breach a wall, and the Romans file in, completely not expecting that the Greys that were stuck inside of this city were lying in an ambush waiting for them to come through that hole. Then they spring their trap and off a bunch of them and chase them back out through that choke point. And apparently this is the first time the Roman army ever had to deal with such a cunning foe. But my favorite part of this story is how the Romans had their siege engines and catapults outside of the city, and the Greys start tunneling underneath. Then they get directly under the siege engines, and, they've got wood supports holding up the earth above. Well, they set all those supports on fire, the ground collapses, and the siege engines fall into the hole. So I want you to imagine looking out your window at a tree about 100 yards away. You can't go out there and measure exactly how far it is. All you can do is dead reckon. Then you go down and start digging a tunnel, and you dig directly under that tree, and you're just spot on directly under it. Yeah, right. Josephus is the Marvel superheroes of his day. Yet he's the only source of information for the destruction of Jerusalem and why it's buried under 20 feet of rubble now. The Romans did not do this. This was cataclysm. I want you to picture this. The Romans are there for 5 months, and then they finally take the city, which means now they get to go in and plunder all the gold, and you can barely keep an army under control once you've taken a city. They're gonna plunder. So then once they've taken everything of value, you then tell them, okay, now we're gonna bury this entire city in 20 feet of rubble. You guys good with that? Yeah, right. I'll have to do a video on the archaeology here, but it would have taken them years to do this. Now, the only archaeological evidence of this siege is found in Rome. There's the Arch of Titus, who led the siege, and on that arch is this bas relief of the Romans plundering the temple and taking the gold menorah and the box of shewbread and the silver trumpets, and they allegedly carried off unimaginable wealth, and they even say that this probably paid for the Colosseum to be built. But let me give you a little breakdown of what I see. Here it looks like we do have an Imperial Roman with a laurel wreath, a sign of victory and conquest. But most of the figures to the left are pretty badly damaged. But up in front of him, you can actually see them pretty well. And this is obviously the Romans carrying off all the plunder, right? Well, here's a modern digital reconstruction showing the scene, and they make sure that you see very clearly that everyone is wearing a victory wreath, right? I mean, they've even got it in green. It's obviously a wreath. Well, hold on, because this guy you can see pretty good, and it looks like he's wearing a headband. Then you look at all these guys, and this guy in the middle especially, you can see that it's a headband going all the way around his head. And wow, this has just about been erased off the internet since the last time I talked about this, but that is what they used to dress like. They used to wear a headband. Here they're showing it kind of like a flat do-rag, but all of the old movies show kind of a twisted headband like what you're seeing here. So if you really look at this, you see that everyone except for that one guy with the laurel wreath is all wearing headbands, indicating these are all Hebrews carrying all this. And I can tell that they're being intentionally misleading by them not knowing this. They know this just like I know this, only they colored all this in green like they're all laurel wreaths. And they're obviously all just wearing robes. These are not soldiers geared up for battle and carrying off the plunder. What this is accurately depicting is one important Roman with a bunch of Hebrews carrying all this stuff. So for all I know, they could have helped them retrieve all their treasures from some other enemy. And it would not surprise me in the least if someone actually helped them in the past and then they turned around and said, no, they conquered us. Just the eternal victim. So you could say this is just them making the Hebrews carry everything. But as I just pointed out, this could be portraying something completely different, and they are being intentionally dishonest in portraying this and telling you everyone here is wearing a wreath when most of them are wearing headbands. Other problems here are, look at this bas relief. You can see that it's been chiseled out all the way around it. So it looks to me like they removed this from somewhere else and inserted it here. Then going further into this is a single arch of triumph. And they say that the Arch of Titus provided a model for many arches built after the 16th century, most famously the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. So from the 16th century on, this is how they were building arches. But the Arch of Constantine is a triple arch. The Arch of Septimus Severus, which was also mud flooded up to the bottom of the lower arches, is a triple arch. Here's what's left of the Arch of Augustus, not the one in the background. We're standing in the ruins of it here, which is also a triple arch monument. So it seems like pretty much all of the ancient arches are triple arches. And then there's the Arch of Titus, and that's how they did arches from the 16th century on. You see the problem here? Then it gets worse when a second Arch of Titus was found. Now, the problem with this is archaeologists could not recall another case of two arches being built to celebrate the same victory. Never happened in any other circumstance except for the Arch of Titus. Then it turns out that this second one they found was a massive triple arch like the other triple arches from the ancient times. And it was much larger than the single gated counterpart on Palatine Hill, the single arch I showed you. So it seems a lot to me like this was built in the Middle Ages, and there's no telling where this bas relief came from. So I personally think that Josephus was a character created around the 1400s, and they set this up in Rome to legitimize that. So So now let's move on to some of our other ancient sources. Here he's talking about Trajan's column.
Something like the Bayer Tapestry, it obviously tells a story. There are all sorts of scenes there. The problem is we don't know what it meant. On the Bayer Tapestry, you've got nice little captions, Heraldus Rex Interfectus Est, King Harold is killed, all this sort of thing. With Trajan's column, all you have is the pictures. We happen to know that the Emperor Trajan wrote, just like Julius Caesar, a detailed set of commentaries on his campaigns. And one line of those commentaries has survived, and it's survived in a grammatical text, and it illustrates the use of the accusative case. It basically talks about, and the Romans crossed a river. That's it. And from that, and these pictures, we're trying to reconstruct a complex set of campaigns. And that's quite a well-documented period. There are long eras of Roman history where we know extremely little, and there are other periods where the army is harder to see archaeologically. We'll come on to that in a moment.
So we've got one line of the original surviving document saying, and the Romans crossed the river, and that's it. And he says that this is a well-documented point of history. And then he says, well, we also have no archaeological evidence of the other stories of supposed conquest of the Roman legions.
For all the great wars against Hannibal, against Carthage, against the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, the wars in Spain and Gaul in the Republican period, these are almost invisible archaeologically, because the army that fights them is invisible. It is the citizen body of Rome at war. And you can see how Romans lived, but you very rarely get to see how they fight archaeologically. Starting to change a little bit. There's a team in Spain that seem to have found the site of the Battle of Baecula from the Second Punic War. And they're turning up some interesting stuff already, but it's very early.
So they have recently found one site that they think might have been a battleground, but there is no archaeological evidence for the entire Roman Republic. Now, the Roman Republic came first and then the Roman Empire, and I think there is a lot of evidence of the Roman Empire. And I'm not going to fully explain this right now, but I think Platon wrote Plato's Republic in the 1300s at the height of the humanist movement, then attributed it to Plato from 1,000 years before, and they may have just invented the entire Roman Republic back at that time. I think we'll touch more on that here in a little bit.
This is the army where the historian Josephus, the fellow who had fought as a rebel in the Jewish rebellion in AD 66 against the Roman army. He's one of the very few people who gives us an account of what it was like to face the legions. But then, of course, being rather a cunning individual, manages to change sides and gets to be a favorite of Vespasian, who wins the civil war that follows and becomes emperor, so writes us a history really very much more from the Roman point of view than the rebel point of view.
So once again, we're led back to Josephus. It's always Josephus. Now, let's go at this from a different angle.
Now, at this point, there are actually two other popes already. There's one in Rome and there's one in Avignon. And Cossa doesn't get into the kind of canonical lists of popes. He actually is deposed after 5 years. He was accused of sleeping with more than 200 women in 7 years. Now, I think that is...
Now, I just wanted to throw that part in because I've told you guys how we've just got a list of popes for 600 years or something. But the thing is there was a pope in every city proclaiming to be the real pope. So if you take one 50-year period where you have 10 different popes in different cities, and then you say, well, actually, they were all popes of Rome, well, then you just made up 500 years of time. And I think the Dark Ages are that simple. So here he's going to be talking about Cosimo de' Medici, who was the Red Shield of back in the day, 1300s. And this is the family that really financed the Renaissance.
He points out that when he was in his late 20s, there was an inventory of his house. And the books were things like Cicero, Julius Caesar, Virgil, Martial, Ovid, Tacitus. And she says, it's a big library for the period by any standards, but very unusual for somebody who's in their late 20s and is basically a banker, not a scholar.
And Dominic, can I just pick up on that list? Tacitus, he has only just been discovered. So we know that Boccaccio, the great 14th century Florentine writer, is reading Tacitus, but nobody else really knows about him. So for Cosimo to have Tacitus, he's amazingly cutting edge. It's kind of almost avant-garde in his tastes.
Okay, what he's alluding to there is that all of the ancient Greek texts got translated into Arabic in the 8th century. And then they call it the 12th century Renaissance when all of these texts get translated from Arabic into Latin. Strange thing is, is Latin was a dead language for 700 years at that time. It declined in the 5th century, but only the Roman Catholic Church maintained Latin as its official language, the only group that has a list of popes for that time period. So everything is messed up here, but it's extremely rare that Cosimo de' Medici would have had these texts because the Western world didn't have access to these at this time. That's why he's saying it's avant-garde. Wow, the rich billionaire came up with all of these ancient texts that support his humanist movement perfectly. See what I'm saying?
The bank. So he expands the bank across Europe. So there are representatives, to the list of cities: London, Naples, Cologne, Geneva, Lyon, Basel, Avignon, Bruges, Antwerp, Lubeck, Ancona, Bologna, Rome, Pisa, Venice. There are Medici representatives and Medici branch offices everywhere. And they can source relics, silk, manuscripts, choir boys, you name it.
So I really need to do a video on the Medicis at some time, but this is just giving you a little idea. But let me put this into historical context. Right as the Knights Templar disappear, remember they were the international bankers of Europe during the Crusades and all that, they disappear, and then the Medicis take over international finance at the exact same time, and they have all of this lost knowledge, coincidentally.
He has to lend the city, his own city, loads of money, and he takes home 14,000 florins in interest. It's worked out splendidly for him. So I think this is a perfect example of the fusion of politics, finance, of religious faith, and culture that powers the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. So first of all of these scholars from Constantinople, they have turned up with loads of Greek manuscripts that they're going to quote from in these debates. So their bags are kind of bulging with manuscript rolls or whatever. This is when Plato really gets reintroduced. It's Platon, this guy who actually he doesn't even approve of Christianity. He wants to go back to worshipping the ancient gods. And he brings Plato in Greek and he sets up a school there. And this is where Plato really becomes part of the bloodstream of the Renaissance. People become very excited about Plato in Florence. They're like, oh, wow, this is amazing, all this stuff. And actually some of these manuscripts end up in Cosimo's library. I think.
So, like I was talking about earlier, Gemistos Platon, who's financed by the billionaire type Cosimo de' Medici, founded the Platonic Academy of the 1300s as part of the humanist movement, and he just happens to be the one who found these ancient writings in Arabic of the ancient Plato describing the perfect republic, which is basically the humanist utopia. Isn't all this really convenient? I mean, this would be like Karl Marx just conveniently finding a 1,000-year-old document that perfectly aligns with his worldview. So anyway, I'll have to do a whole video about what happened at that period, but I just wanted to show you how sketchy our sources of ancient history actually are. They're looking at the same archaeological evidence and carvings that we are, with very minute amounts of actually surviving manuscripts saying this is what happened. And it almost always circles back to Josephus, which is a bunch of poopy. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.